Hi everyone, my name is Joe. As I said, I recognise a bunch of you in the chat, so many of us have met before, but for those of you who haven't met me, I'm currently a freelance developer community consultant, so I help developer-facing companies with their community strategies, and in the past I've worked for companies like GitHub, PayPal, and recently Major League Hacking, where I helped with the APAC expansion, which is where I have met a lot of you lovely folks. So today I'm going to be talking to you about remote working, particularly asynchronous working, drawing on my experience from the entirety of my career of working remotely and particularly working in a time zone that's very different from the other people that I'm working with, which I hope is going to be super relevant to your experiences right now as MLH Fellows in the middle of what is kind of an unprecedented global opportunity to work remotely. We'll put a silver lining on it like that. But also in the future, as more and more companies are starting to embrace remote and out of necessity, but also because it's in demand, the skills that I want to talk to you about today will hopefully be very useful. So, I've done the introduction. As I said, lots of companies are starting to embrace remote because right now, obviously, there is no option. We are in this current COVID quarantine epidemic, and whilst lots of countries are starting to line up with that, we have seen many companies responding to that by saying that their offices won't be reopening throughout the rest of the year, or even that their offices won't be reopening at all, or they'll be looking to embrace remote in the future. Facebook most notably made a big splash about this, where they said they would be permanently relocating thousands of jobs to remote only and changing their global pay scale to accommodate that. So being a remote worker and the skills that you're picking up as MLH Fellows in working remotes with the rest of your team and also with your mentors and the host projects is set you up really well, hopefully, for a future in which you can work wherever you want and whenever you want and however you want. So today we're going to be talking about the skills you need to work remote and asynchronously. We're going to get into the definitions of what remote and asynchronous means, what the differences between the different ways of working remote are, and hopefully we will get you set up and ready to go. So I realized that my camera is a little bit too close to the text here, so I might have to squat a little bit. But I want to start by opening to a question to you folks, which is, what have you enjoyed or not enjoyed about working remotely so far during the fellowship? If you've had past remote work experience at another role, feel free to chip in with that as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about your remote work experience to date. Feel free to unmute and throw some things in. Anyone going to go first?
Yeah, my name is Kunal. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Go ahead. Yeah, you are.
So, as you know, that there are like many open source programs for university students like Google Summer of Code, GCI, Outreachy. This program, I have personally been part of Google Summer of Code as a student and a mentor as well. But when I joined the fellowship, the structure of the program really, I found it to be better than all the other programs because there's this thing that we are working in a pod. And I think that is what is really important when you're working in an open source projects, because when I first started with open source, when I was in my freshman year, I don't think that I would have been able to be that much progressive if it wasn't for the community. So
awesome.
Any doubts that you have, so the community is there to resolve it. And since MLH is like always, pushing us to have like one-on-ones, face-to-face meetings, and these group exercises like show and tell. So I had show and tell also last week. It was like really great, and this is the kind of the structure of the program. Really, I really enjoyed it, and it's working well so far for me and for others as well, I'm sure. Yeah,
that's fantastic to hear. And you've hit on a couple of really important things. The things you said about having a structure and having a community really elevates being remote. And I think one of the things that I quite frequently say is that remote doesn't mean alone. And that is something that it sounds like you're all able to benefit from. And those interactions that you're currently having between meetings, stand-ups, show and tells, and the persistent online communication you're having through the Discord and other places, we're going to be talking about explicit techniques to make those interactions as beneficial and productive as they can be, so that that time that you are able to spend together is as good as it possibly can be. So we're going to split this talk into roughly two halves. There's going to be quite a structured starting 20 minutes or so on remote and async work in a professional context. So we're going to be talking about the difference between space and time when it comes to remote, and particularly we're going to be talking about preparation and communication as the two big groups of skills that will really improve your remote working experience. And then after that, we'll go into a more informal kind of discussion-based personal section, which is more just there to kind of get to the bottom of your concerns with your kind of day-to-day. How do I make this remote thing work? Joe, how have you stayed sane over 6 years of doing this? And I'll just share some general tips for living as a remote worker. So that's much more kind of driven by you folks, but the professional bit, we have some content to get through. So we'll get on with that. So on to the professional section. So I said I want to start talking about the difference between space and time, because when we talk about remote, particularly in the context, oh wow, my chroma key is terrible, I'm sorry, particularly in the context of working professionally with tech companies, we have a distinct difference between these two elements. And I know that some of you have noticed that. I looked at the questions that were asked to Taylor Barnett on her remote discussion the other day and saw a couple of questions where people have observed that tech companies are hiring remote, but it's within certain time zone bounds. So why is that? What is the difference between remote and working asynchronously? So when we talk about working remote, we're mainly talking about physical separation. So we're not in the same place, we're not in the same office. So we might be, for example, I might work from home when my company has another office here in Amsterdam. The more interesting one, I think, that also affects how we work in the physical separation and also actually as workers in an office is when we start to think about time separation. And it's in this time separation that we talk about working asynchronously. So what is asynchronous? What does that mean? Well, I thought I'd bring some JavaScript to the table. So, as you may know from programming, asynchronous code is code that doesn't rely on receiving a result or another operation finishing before it can continue with the computation. So, for example, in JavaScript, we have promises and we have the async await syntax, which lets us, for example, assign a value to a variable, and that value may not be available right now. It might be coming back from a HTTP request to a web API. So there might be a little bit of a round trip with that. It might be waiting on a user's response, a bit of user input, but we're able to continue with the program and not have our whole program halt and wait at this point. And that's very similar to how I want you to think about async working. But to flip that question back on you, can anyone tell me a little bit more about why asynchronous programming is important? Why we have things like async await and why we want to make sure that our programs are asynchronous rather than just purely procedural and synchronous? Anyone want to jump in? No? Okay, cool. I will drive on. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was, yeah, okay. So it's like important because of the event loop.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have asynchronous programming, so if an operation is running, then we cannot really do anything to the DOM. I mean, it's really like blocked. It's a blocked operation. So in order to not have that blocking for the result, we use asynchronous programming.
Perfect. And you hit on the key word that I wanted there, which was blocking. So when we talk about asynchronous programming, what we're trying to do is not block. We're trying not to stop other processes or other tasks from carrying out their work. And when we think about working remotely and asynchronously, I want you to be thinking about the same way, which is that working apart from other people and in different time zones to other people is about not blocking other tasks as much as possible. So making sure that everyone is out of their way and that you're not waiting a really long time to be able to carry on your work. And there's two situations in which we might be blocked, in which we might be waiting on something to be able to do our work. The first one is that everyone must stop what they are doing until the task is complete. So there's some blocker that is coming up in the way and no one can continue on with their work until that one task is complete. And the other one is that maybe you're working independently on something and suddenly there is an unknown or a variable that you don't yet have and you're not able to complete your task until you have that information. Sorry, now I am in the way. I'm just going to crouch down here. So yeah, the number two is someone does not have the information they need to complete the task. So these are the two types of blocking that we're going to see again and again as we go through this talk. So let's see an example of both of these in action in the workplace. So the first one, a time where everyone must stop what they are doing until a given task is complete. We're going to look at scheduling a meeting. So say we want to schedule a meeting with the rest of our team. Say it is a Monday morning and we can't get to work on our project until a certain decision has been made. Maybe it's a design decision, the way we're going to actually implement the feature, or maybe it's go ahead from a stakeholder to say that this is in fact the path we should follow. So we are actually blocked until this decision gets made. And there's many stakeholders in here that should have an input into that conversation, and the developers want to all be in and hear what that meeting is about. So maybe to actually make that decision, we're going to need about 4 people on a call in order to make that decision. So we need to schedule a meeting for 4 people. And now let's say that those 4 people are on multiple time zones. It could be someone in the US, someone here in Amsterdam, someone in India, someone in Australia. Let's get some real interesting time zone variance going on there. So straight away, we run into the problem of actually finding time to do that meeting. It's a Monday morning, you are in the US and you're waiting to get this design decision. It's 9 a.m. for you, you're ready to start your work week. It's already 11 p.m. in Australia, and it's already 6:30 p.m. in India. The workday has finished. So straight away, we're already not getting a decision on the Monday, right? A whole day of work is going to be wasted waiting for this meeting to happen. And like, it's probably going to go several days before we're actually able to find a time that works for everyone. And really, someone is going to end up doing something at an unpleasant time, or we're going to end up having to schedule multi-meetings. Now, this example might seem slightly hyperbolic. You might wonder, like, oh, I'm never going to get that time zone spread. I've had this several times in the last year with several clients, including MLH, where we have had a time zone spread of at least 3 different time zones. So these things do happen in reality. Moving on from the time zones, let's just take it, let's remove time zones from this entirely and just think about the cost and the practicality of that meeting. So we've got 4 people that we need to get together for 1 hour to make this design decision. So that's going to be 4 hours of human time, 4 people spending 1 hour. The average salary for a developer in the US, and I know that salaries vary region to region, so bear with me, this is the US salary. Average US salary for June 2020 is about $86,000. So just for this like 1 hour meeting for 4 developers, that's going to come to a cost of $166 for this 1 hour meeting, which is no small amount. But it's not the end of the world. That's not the highest a business expense could be. And if it's a very important decision, that seems more than worth it. But then consider that the average US employee spends 22 hours a week in meetings. And if we follow that math all the way through, just these 4 people from their very productive meetings will have incurred a cost of nearly $3,660 by the end of the week, which is almost enough to pay a whole other person's salary, right? It's not a small amount of money. And that's not necessarily a problem. I'm not here to tell you that meetings are bad. In fact, we're going to do the very opposite and tell you that meetings are vital. But what I want to raise is, were those 88 hours of those 4 people spending 22 hours a week used as effectively as they could be? Were they blocking? Were they holding up decisions? Were they taking a long time to be scheduled? Probably yes. So there may be some wastage here that we can cut down on with the right skills. Let's go to the other example of blocking, when someone doesn't have the information they need to complete a task. And I want to take you on a typical example of a Slack message that I receive every day for this. But before we get to Slack, we're going to rewind time a little bit, and we're going to look at carrier pigeons. We're going to go all the way back to, very pretty carrier pigeon. We're going to go all the way back to 1931 with pigeons used relatively widely still to convey messages between people. And we're going to look at a particularly famous pigeon that started off in Arras, France, and flew all the way to Saigon in Vietnam, a journey which today by plane would still take over a day to do, and is about 7,200 miles. And it took this pigeon 24 days to make that journey. Now imagine at the end of that, 7,200 miles, 24 days, it's almost a month. That's a long old time in pigeon life. And the person gets the letter and they open the letter and it just says hi. You would forgive that pigeon for being pretty angry that it has thrown that message for that long. And I feel the same way when I receive a Slack message that just says hi. And why do I have that reaction to a Slack message that just says hi? Why does this make me angry? Well, let's again go to our time zones. Imagine that I'm in New York and you're in Delhi. That's a time zone of 9.5 hours. And at 4:30 p.m. On a Monday, I decide to send you, I need something from you. I need some information. There's something that you know that I need to continue my work. So I send you a message that just says, hi. It's already 2 a.m. for you. You are hopefully already asleep. My experience with people like Harshil tells me that you are often not asleep, but you should be asleep at 2 a.m. So you don't reply. The morning you wake up, very prompt, 9 a.m. or straight at work, and you send me a message. All I've given you is a hi, no further context. So you don't have a lot to go on. So you say, hi, how are you? Very reasonable response. It's now 9 a.m. your time. It is 11:30 p.m. in New York. which they're probably not asleep, but they should hopefully no longer be working. So already we're now at the end of Tuesday, and we haven't even really started to get to the information that's needed at this point, and entire work days have been spent and wasted. So why am I sharing these examples? As I said, I'm not here to tell you that meetings are bad, and I'm definitely not here to tell you that you shouldn't be using Slack. That does make sense, yeah. But what I want to show you is just some like simple ways that when you're working across time zones, little gestures and ways of working that you wouldn't normally think about rapidly add up to huge wastage and huge blocking actions. So we want to get to the bottom of how to resolve those and how to be non-blocking. So another bit of audience interaction. Let's have some people other than Kunal answer this question, please. Kunal, thank you for answering too. The question is, what do these three things have in common? Grabbing a coffee with someone, tapping someone on the shoulder and having a brief conversation, or scheduling a meeting? What do those three things have in common? Would anyone like to chip in with some ideas? Someone feeling brave?
Human interaction.
Human interaction, that's a great one. Absolutely. Anyone else? Okay, cool. I'll move it on. So this one I do have to admit is a little bit of a setup, because this is one that I think you wouldn't normally get. But the thing with all of these and all these actions is that they are low cost to you as the person who is initiating them. Think about it. You're at your desk and you're suddenly stuck, and you know that a senior developer is behind you, and you suddenly realize you don't know how to do this thing, or you have a question. It's really easy for you to walk over to them and say, hey, can I pick your brain for a minute? That fateful phrase, can I pick your brain for a minute? Or it's really easy for you to say, oh, hey, I need to have a decision made, or I need to chat about this thing. I'll just quickly throw some time in someone's calendar. They are all very low cost to you as the person initiating those contacts. But on the flip side of that, they can be very high cost to the person who you are doing that to. So for example, someone is in that fateful deep flow state we always, as programmers, seem to talk about, the one where they're deep in concentration and they're in the middle of jamming out loads of code, and you go over and interrupt that flow of thought. Or you grab an hour of someone's time just because you had a question, and suddenly that's an hour blocking someone's calendar, and you haven't even really at this point started to think about what that meeting should look like yet. Basically, these things all rely on preparation that often we don't do. I was going to ask a question at this point, which was how people usually prepare for meetings, but I thought that was a bit unfair, because I know if you're anything like the vast majority of people that I have ever worked with, you will put a meeting in the calendar long before preparation for that meeting even starts to occur to you. So why do we meet? This is the question I want to pose to you folks. What are some of the reasons that we might schedule a meeting with someone? When you think like, hey, I want to have a chat with that person, I want to put some time on that calendar, or we need to have a meeting, what are some of the things that you might have a meeting for? This one is not a trick. This is just, I want to know some things that are good for meetings. Anyone have any ideas? Go on, Kana.
So when we need to like report our progress to the team members.
Absolutely.
And the second point is if someone's facing any blockers, so the team members can help them resolve that. So
for sure. So status meetings are a big one, particularly in the tech industry. We love to have stand-ups, particularly in the mornings before we get started for work. That's a really great one. And coming up and ideating around problems and solving issues is another really big one. I've got those and some more. So making decisions is one we touched on earlier. We might have reached a point where we need to get input from the decision maker, the team lead, the tech lead, something like that. Exchange ideas, which is something that Kunal raised. To make plans, it might be the start of a project and you need to actually plan out what this project is going to look like and what the software is going to look like, how you're going to architect it, how you're going to approach it. To seek advice, another point that you raised, Kunal. And just to get time face to face. This is particularly important with managers or with peers, mentors. There is no replacement for just spending time talking to people. No amount of slacking is going to replace that interaction. So that is perfectly valid. But the question I want to pose to you folks is whether the examples that Kunal raised and also the rest of the examples on here, whether meetings are actually necessary for those things. Do we need to meet to make decisions? Is there another way we can do that? I will put the obvious one out there, that we as society make huge decisions on a pretty regular basis via elections and voting without having to get everyone into one room. Exchanging ideas. Again, is there another way we can do this? Is there another way we can make plans? Is there another way we can seek advice without getting all these people into one room? So how else could we do these things? Anyone got any alternate ideas for ways that we could do those things differently? I think there we go. So how else could we do these things here? Does anyone want to pick one of those and give us an idea of a different way we could accomplish that goal?
I guess a lot of people use like white papers, like so they write one document and they send the link to everyone asking for feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. White papers and request for comments are kind of the RFCs that are a natural extension of that. This is very popular in a lot of open source projects. Rust is a big famous one for their RFC process, for example, where someone will write a very well constructed and thought through technical document and submit it for comments from other people. I see that Ayush is unmuted. Would you like to go ahead? Was there another idea for how we could do any of these asynchronously or without meetings? No? Okay, I will drive on then. So here's some ways that I think we can do, or rather, here's some things that I think are important to consider when we are thinking about whether these things need to be meeting. The big one is an example we already walked through. Whenever we schedule a meeting to do one of these things, we are putting a stop in time where we say no progress can be made until this particular event has occurred, which is a good reason to find other ways other than meetings to do these things. Another one is inclusivity. If we're having meetings, again, I go to the example of the morning stand-up. If you're trying to do a stand-up, by the nature of what a stand-up is, they are usually very good at the start or the end of the day. And if you've got a team that is time zone removed, everyone's start and end of the day isn't the same time. So just by having meetings, we potentially make it impossible for some people to contribute to that meeting. There is also the unfortunate fact that meetings as a format favor certain types of personality and certain demographics. If you're an introverted person, so you're not as keen on making a big stand in a meeting or being loud or making your point or interrupting people to get something across, it can be quite challenging to make headway in a busy meeting with other big personalities. And unfortunately, there is data that shows that many people of different races and genders have difficulties communicating in meetings or not communicating in meetings, being heard in meetings, particularly because certain demographics, namely white men, tend to show up disproportionately in the amount of words said in a meeting. So meetings can be quite difficult for lots of people to actually be heard in. There's always time wasted in the meeting. As I said, there's no replacement for face-to-face contact, but I'm sure you have all had meetings where the first 10, 15, 20 minutes is just small talk and hearing how people's dogs are and that kind of thing. And those things are delightful, and social interaction with your team is really important. But it's really interesting to me that we always have that social interaction with our team almost as a side effect. We so infrequently make time to just like chat with a teammate that we want to catch up with. And instead it's always these brief minutes at the beginning or end of meetings. So we consider that activity important enough to take time out of a scheduled meeting for, but not important enough to actually schedule separate time for, which is really interesting. And also there is just lots of downtime in meetings generally, agenda items that haven't moved on quick enough, that kind of thing. And then lastly, documentation. Very rarely are meetings documented enough. You have to have an assigned note taker to properly capture what happened in that meeting, to capture the decisions, to capture the outcomes. And that so often doesn't happen. And if it doesn't happen, those decisions could very quickly be lost or inaccessible to other members who weren't in that meeting. I just pressed the wrong button. So a question back to you folks. Say we stopped having meetings altogether. All of those things that I presented to you, we no longer did by meetings. We did it all in Slack. We did it all in documents, with white papers, with RFCs. What do we lose? What is this world without meetings look like? What are some of the things that we may be hurt for not having meetings? Anyone got any ideas?
I think being able to expect like a instant response to whatever you say is very helpful, so that you don't have to, wait for like a few hours for a response and then have to context switch back to your whatever you said.
For sure.
Yeah, so
that feedback loop, definitely.
Yeah, for decision making, I think that's a really important thing there.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if like you're trying to get a big decision or big design out of the way in one fell swoop. Having that meeting is going to be a very quick way to get everyone's input, for sure. Anyone else have any other ideas?
Yeah, it's very hard to express well-constructed thought over, like not everyone can write their what they are thinking. in a very well manner that is easier for others to understand, as opposed to like directly telling face to face.
For sure, absolutely. Writing is hard, and actually the whole second half of this talk, or the second half of this section, is all about writing. Writing, especially async, is super important and is a difficult communication style and takes time and practice to do well. And so just being able to informally chat about something is going to be really important and necessary for people to get certain ideas across. Some other things that we gain by having a meeting are emotional context. I'm sure all of you have had the experience, particularly with a manager or someone senior to you, where they send you a message and you're staring at it for a while being like, are they mad at me? I can't tell. Like, it's really hard to tell someone's attitude or tone in a message. I used to work with a guy at GitHub who I won't name, but they are honestly one of the kindest, gentlest, nicest humans I have ever met. But I swear to God, every message they send sounds like you're about to be killed. They just have a really matter-of-fact and harsh tone that as soon as you meet them and as soon as you hear that voice and you can put the voice to the text, all of the menace disappears. But for those first couple of months when I was working with this person remotely and only working with them over Slack and hadn't really met them in person to be able to assign their emotion and their way of being to their text, I was tense a lot of the time. And that's just the way of things. And we have ways around this now. We have emoji, we have ways of decorating our text so it's not as intimidating, but that's still always going to be a factor that's there. Another one is devoted time. When you make time when you have a meeting, you carve out that time and you say, now is when it's going to happen. We're going to make the decision in this meeting and we're going to get it done. Whereas if it's a process that's happening asynchronously, people will get to it in different parts of their work days. They might get to it on different days. And as was mentioned in the questions, it can take a long time to get that decision. We've already spoken about FaceTime and spend time face-to-face with people. There is sometimes no replacement for that. And as Ankit said, speech is a valuable communication method that is certainly sometimes more accessible than writing. And then ease of expression comes into that as well. It's just easier sometimes to get your ideas across or to have people correct your ideas when you're struggling to explain something. So the pros and cons of these two different things. Not having meetings, we benefit from inclusivity, from the time being non-blocking, from no time wasted, or from less time wasted, and from having naturally documenting processes. From the meetings themselves, we get emotional context, we get devoted time to get the task done, and we get that ease of communication that comes from speech. So how do we get the best of both? Is there a way to get the best of both? I think both of these things are necessary. Ideally, we want to reduce the amount of time that we spend in meetings, that we spend on blocking tasks and that we spend wasted, but we want that ease of expression, we want that face time, and we want that quickness of decisions. An interesting example, and I hesitate to put Jeff Bezos in my slides, but an interesting example is something that Amazon do and that Jeff Bezos himself was doing a lot of I guess, media appearances about back in 2015, which is that Amazon have this way of meeting for their exec teams called the 6-page memo, where basically what they do is to have a meeting, you as the meeting initiator must write a 6-page memo. So you must write 6 pages of prose, of text, laying out the idea, laying out the case for that idea before the meeting. That is the basis of the meeting, a white paper you could call it. And then the meeting actually takes place around this memo. So you might have a 1-hour meeting where the first 30 minutes is everyone just sat in a room reading the memo in silence, just reading in the same room. And then the second half of the meeting is directed discussion. So the person hosting the meeting would say like, cool, page 4, paragraph 6, tell me what you think of this section or what we need to change here. And then that ends with actions for how the memo should be changed or how the idea in the memo should be changed and the path forward. The leadership teams go with a 6-page format, and other parts of Amazon have adapted this to a shorter 2-pager. And there's lots of material on the web for how they do this and how lots of theories about how this gave them the competitive edge. What do you think of this? Would you use this in your meetings? Before you had any meeting, would you be willing to write a 6-page memo? Would you think you'd be able to write a 6-page memo on any idea you had?
I think a agenda or something sounds better, but this is too much.
Sure, too much, definitely. I can definitely see that side of it. Anyone else have any thoughts? Cool. Well, I think it has a really interesting list of pros and cons. I think it does help us get a lot of the way towards having our cake and eating it, in having both sides of these things. We don't really get non-blocking. We get non-blocking to some extent, and I've put a kind of like minus mark against this, because we do get some non-blocking, which is that I reckon a lot of ideas end up filtering out in the writing of this memo process. In the writing of this memo process, I think a lot of ideas don't make it to a final meeting, which reduces the amount of meetings, and so I give it some points for non-blocking. Same for inclusivity. I don't think we're still having the meeting. We're still having a situation where people need to be heard in a physical space. But by doing the 6-page memo, people who are writing those memos may have an opportunity to make their arguments in advance. So that's helpful. We are going to reduce the time wasted because, as I said, this process will naturally filter out some types of meetings. And everyone is very clear what is going to happen at that meeting. And everyone is very clear what's expected of them and what the outputs are. Oh, sorry, I just realized I don't have the chat open. Let me open that. I haven't missed anything. Okay, cool. It's naturally self-documenting. If no matter what happens in the meeting, we still have that 6-pager, which is very valuable institutional knowledge. We get the emotional context from being in the room, we get the devoted time, and in fact, we actually make time for everyone to read the memo, which is really interesting. I'm sure many of you have said you've read the materials or done the homework and not actually done it. We get that face time. And we kind of get the ease of expression. People in the meeting have an easy way to input into the memo, but obviously the person who's writing the memo has a really hard time. So we get somewhere into both lists of pros and cons. And that's not to say that this is the perfect way of meeting. I'm not telling you to all go write 6-page memos. I'm giving this as an interesting example of kind of out of the box thinking, of rethinking a meeting and challenging what a meeting is in order to get some of the advantages of remote working while still having those meetings. And I want to share this quote from Leslie Lamport, who's one of the early developers on LaTeX. If you don't know LaTeX, it's a very famous markup language for writing documents, particularly favored in academia and mathematics. And Leslie says, writing is nature's way of telling us how lousy our thinking is, which, to go to Ankit's point earlier, writing is hard. Expressing your ideas in writing is really, really hard. And some of that is just that it's difficult. And some of that is also that when you try to explain an idea in detail, you find problems with that idea, or you find places you get stuck. And an example of that you may all be familiar with is rubber duck debugging. If you're not familiar with rubber duck debugging, this is the Ducky the Debugger mascot from last MLH season, made for rubber duck debugging. Rubber duck debugging is the idea that before you go and ask someone else a question, you ask that question to a rubber duck first. And the reason that this works is very similar to that 6-page memo. In trying to explain your problem to someone, you often solve the problem. So the whole thing is like, hey, explain your problem to a rubber duck and you will solve the problem. Because you're taking that time to think ahead, to prepare, and to work to step your way through the problem. Whereas normally what we do is we go, oh, I have a problem, and don't think about it anymore and go straight over and ask someone, and we bother them, and then we have to explain it to them. And by the time we finished explaining it, we've solved it. Writing is kind of like doing this process before meetings, writing the 6-page memo or some equivalent, is very similar to rubber duck debugging in those benefits. So the key point here is that, I guess what I'm trying to say is that these meetings, these things that we consider valuable about working in the same space as someone, the instant communication, the meetings, the coffee breaks, are actually just an excuse for us to avoid preparation. When we go like, oh, I'm going to go have a quick chat with that person, we very frequently stop ourselves to say like, is there another way I can get that information? Or do I need to have that conversation right now? Or is there something I should think about or prepare before that conversation? I like to say it's externalizing your preparation, because rather than doing the work up front, you delay the work for a future group of people to do for you. So try not to avoid that preparation. And before you go ahead and bow to those instincts to do synchronous things, ask why. Like, does this need to be a meeting? Is there another way of accomplishing this? Is there a way this meeting should look? Make sure you have an agenda, to Kartik's point. Make sure you have an agenda and make sure it's followed. Keep people on task, move on, divide time up for stuff. Make sure that every meeting ends in actions. If a meeting did not end in a concise action that someone can do, probably didn't need to be a meeting. And then make sure that meeting is documented so that A, you remember what happened, but B, other people who weren't there can benefit from it as well. So on to, when it comes to meetings and being non-blocking, how do those preparation steps help you be non-blocking? Well, by asking why and whether something needs to be a meeting, we reduce the number of meetings that exists. by doing agendas and sticking to them, hopefully we're able to cut down the length of our meetings, so the amount of time that people are blocked. By having actions, we're able to make sure that that time spent blocking does actually produce outcomes and therefore moves people along in their work. And by making documentation, we're making sure that information is accessible for people who aren't in the meetings. And that's going to lead us on to the second half of this, which is that making information accessible to people who aren't in the meetings gets us right into communication and how important it is for remote work. And this is all at the heart of the problem, that someone does not have the information they need to complete a task. How do we make sure that everyone always has the information they need to complete the task they're currently working on, even when their source of that information may be offline or asleep at the current time? So I'd love to hear again from you. What is some information that you might look for when you're starting a new task? So say you're using Trello or Jira and you've picked a new task up off the board and you're about to get started on it. What is some information that you need to complete that task?
I think context to the problem is important. Like the person who put up the Jira or Trello ticket should provide context and information that the other person who might be working on it should need. So that helps.
It's a very good one. Ankit, I see you've unmuted.
Yes, and also like it's very important to have a checklist of the tasks that they're expected like to be done after, so that you know like now the task is complete, or like these are the things that you have to do. Like right.
So the actual deliverables and what completion means for that task.
Yeah,
that kind of
stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, for sure. Here's some other things. So to coming into context is the plan and design. So what does this thing I'm implementing actually look like, or what do I need to produce? So it comes down to deliverables. Any decisions that have previously been made about that. So this comes into, again, the context. Kartik, you captured a lot by saying context. Decisions such as like how this thing should look, or when it needs to be done, that kind of thing. And then a big one is trust and authority, that you actually have the position and the capability to carry this issue out, and that any decisions you might make along the way are valid and you don't have to go back and get more input for those. Basically, that you are a decision maker in the context of that piece of work. So where do we get this information from before we start work? Often that will be meetings and that will be conversations. It will be messages in Slack. It will be information added to the ticket that's been opened. And on the flip side of this, where do you provide this information? If you're opening an issue for someone else, how do you make sure that all those things, all that context, all that trust that you're imbuing in someone else to carry out this task, how do you communicate that to someone who picks up this task? Because if we don't do that, we may block someone and make them unable to do their work. So as an example of this, I want to talk about asynchronous working at GitHub. So I was a student program manager at GitHub for about 2.5 years. And GitHub does a lot of things really interestingly where they work remotely. So GitHub is primarily a remote company, or was primarily a remote company at the time. And GitHub uses GitHub for everything, which really informs the way they work remotely. So to give you an example of this, I'm going to open up this issue, which is a real issue on a GitHub project. CLI is the new GitHub command line interface. So it's an open source project. So we're going to be able to see real GitHub staff working as GitHub staff do in a remote friendly context on a real issue. So let's go ahead and open this up and let's hope this works. Yeah. Okay. I'm streaming this across 2 computers. So I'm going to be facing this way for a bit, which is going to be slightly awkward. So let me mash Control+ on this. So this is a random issue I picked from the CLI board because it had a lot of comments, and all the people involved in this issue are GitHubbers. So we've got Amanda Pinkska, who is one of the GitHubbers on the team. And this issue is interesting because this issue is getting to a lot of decisions and discussion. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about the way that GitHub uses issues, which is that they use them as their distributed conversations. So they're not just a place to file a problem with a piece of code, they're a place to have those conversations. Because actually when you look at a GitHub issue, it's a forum thread, right? Like you've got a title, you've got the initial post that opened it, and then after that you have replies. So it's a threaded conversation, just as you might have in Slack, just as you might have in a discourse forum. So there's no reason we can't use this for things other than just problems with code and for tracking our decisions. And the GitHub team, as I said, is massively distributed. And because they are massively distributed, they often want to have these conversations in places like issues so that other people who are not on the same time zone are able to read those conversations and know why decisions were made. Say, for example, I'm in the future, I'm working on this piece of code. I can come to this issue and see why it was exactly the way it was. So you see here that Amanda's opened the issue, and then Billy has come in asking some questions about it, to which he's able to get the answers. And then we see that Amanda is sharing some thinking about how this thing should look. And what it should look like, and they're just kind of ballparking this and throwing it around. This is where another really cool thing about issues comes in, which is that GitHub Issues brings together lots of different parts of context and history. So here we can see in the timeline that at this point in the issue, so not in the opening, at this point, a label needs design was added, which is useful. It's a useful sign, right? They have a label that says, hey, we don't know how this feature should be implemented right now. It needs design. And we can see that at this point in the conversation, they've come to that conclusion and that label has been added. This conversation continues and we start to see this issue referenced in other ones. So this is building up that context. We know where this conversation is being used. We know who else is interested in the decisions that are made here. I suddenly know that this person thinks that this conversation is relevant to their problem, and so I know to keep them in the loop or to involve them in future discussion on it. We then start to get down to decisions being made, people inputting their opinions, and finally we start to get pull requests being opened. And these pull requests aren't all relevant to this, and some of these pull requests, some of these issues and pull requests being opened are variations or sub-themes of this issue, where they've started to say, I think actually the last one, there's an issue in this thread somewhere that says, actually, I think this is more than one issue that's spread that other conversation out. So you see the evolution of decisions, you see the conversation that might otherwise all just be lost to a meeting room, except we can all participate in this and all see how that decision was made. So if I come to this later, or I'm someone who's working on this code, I can see exactly their train of thought. I can decide that I want to actually tweak this bit, or I want to ask someone a question about that. And it's a really helpful log of what actually occurred. And this is I picked this very intentionally because this is how GitHub works and everything. Like, there are whole repositories within GitHub that contain no code and they're just for decisions. Most famously, the legal department edits all of their contracts within a GitHub repo using pull requests because of the conversation and the decisions that they're able to make. Let me bring up my slides again. Cool. So to kind of summarize that, at GitHub, issues aren't just for code. They are for design discussions. They are for decisions. They are for vigorous referencing that provide what I call institutional knowledge, which is that I know that in the future, so like GitHub has always done this. So when I was there, say there was something that I wanted to do and I was like, oh, what has this been tried before? Has there been any prior discussion about this? I can just go into the GitHub organization and search for that and know that I'm searching all 10 years of GitHub's history and find any conversation that's happened around that. And that is fascinating and powerful. It gives you all the context you need, and most importantly, it gives you all of the permission you need, right? Like, you don't have to, if there's a reason something hasn't been done, you can find out that reason and how to resolve that problem, right? Another big rule at GitHub is if it doesn't have a URL, it didn't happen. So if a conversation occurs and there is not a link that I can follow to see that conversation or see the output of that conversation or to see that design document or to see that piece of code, it didn't happen. And this is the idea that even if we meet in person, those notes are put in a GitHub issue or put in a Google Doc, and that URL is made available. If we have a code snippet that's being used somewhere, that's versioned and we have a URL to it available. If a Slack conversation is particularly important, we save that Slack link, that link to that message somewhere where it's accessible. If there's a call or a meeting that happens, that's recorded and the link is accessible. This is so that you can reference it in future conversations, but again, it's so that whole history is preserved, and anyone who needs it, anyone who wasn't able to attend that meeting because they were somewhere else, has access to that information. So let's use those things we've just spoken about and get back to our dreaded hi Slack message. So let's take a very typical example. You've logged on and you've been sent a message, this message that says, hi, how are you? Could you send me some info on the design decision in last week's meeting? Very typical message. Someone on your team is asking about a decision that was made in the meeting you were in last week. And straight away, this might give you this kind of reaction. Some things that are stressful to me here is like, I need some info. What info are they looking for? which exact meeting? Maybe I had multiple meetings last week. Why are they asking this? Do they have a problem? How can I help this person? Just see how this could be phrased, how we could communicate effectively in a way that gives everyone the information they need to respond to this, and make sure that we don't have that trip we had earlier where we were going around in the big loop, never actually taking days to answer the question. A significantly longer example. Hi, how are you? I know it's late for you, so please don't respond right now. I don't need this information until end of day my time tomorrow. Could you please write 2 to 3 lines explaining the rationale behind the design decision decided in the 18th of June meeting? A link to those meeting notes. I have to relay that to the team in Sydney and want to make sure I do justice to the idea. Let's break this down a little bit and see why this is good. I actually edited something here, I'll come on to that. So the pink highlighted sections are the sections of this which are interesting. So I know it's late for you. This is a topic we're going to touch on in a minute, but when you're working asynchronously, remember that other people are probably in different time zones, and that the way we communicate now, particularly Slack, particularly Discord, particularly messages, they love to throw big angry notifications in our faces, big flashing red bubbles, and people instinctively want to reply. Please let people know that you don't, when you expect to reply, that you don't expect to reply, so that they don't end up interrupting their personal lives to do work when they really should be enjoying themselves or not, at least relaxing. Ideally, rather than sending a Slack message, you would do something like send a scheduled email, so that you write an email and you schedule it to send in the morning on their time, so they don't get that notification at all. But at the very least, let them know your expectations. And let me get onto the time. So I changed this from the previous slide. I gave an explicit time, 5 p.m. New York time on Tuesday. Time zones are wibbly wobbly and vague, right? If I say end of day, my time, you have to go do the work to work out when that is. End of day doesn't mean the same thing. Quite often that's abbreviated to EOD. Don't send acronyms, make everything you do clear, because that may be misconstrued. Make sure that everything is clear and the day is decided, because those lines will wobble. So just if you have a deadline for something, relay it as clearly as you can so that the expectations know. Could you please write 2 to 3 lines explaining the rationale behind the decision? I'm specifying what I expect from them, what I need from them, and making it clear basically how much time is needed. Just 2 to 3 lines. That's an easy ask, right? It's much less scary than the previous one of, can you send me some stuff? I've then told them exactly which meeting and linked to the notes from that meeting so that they have the full context of what I'm talking about. And this last line is particularly important. I want to relay that to the team in Sydney. I want to make sure I do justice to the idea. Here, you are giving them the psychological safety they need. They know why you need that information. They know it's because you're trying to relay that idea to someone else and trying to represent their idea. They know it's not because you're questioning the idea. That's super important that you've relayed that exactly like what it's for. It tamps down all of that immediate alarm from like, oh, why is this person asking me this question? And makes it really clear what's going on. So what I want to ask you to do is to over-communicate. Never just send that hi, or try not to be vague. When you're communicating right messages to people, think about communicating the expectations, when it's due, how long it needs to be, provide them all the context, they know what you're speaking about, link to past messages, quote past messages, link to meeting notes, establish trust, communicate to them exactly why you need this information or the reason you're asking, and make sure that any deliverables that result from this ask are clear to them so they know exactly what to deliver to you and know how much time to spend on it. And then the final point, which we've touched on a little bit accidentally, is no one is async unless everyone is async. So imagine the situation where you are the only remote person on your team and everyone else on your team is having physical meetings and they're writing really bad notes. Your life is going to be very difficult, right? So whenever you are doing anything that may be synchronous, may be in person, think about what you would need as a person who is time zone remote to interact with that object. Because these things I've shared with you, these asynchronous tips, they don't just make life better when you work remotely, they make life better when you work in an office, right? Like if we are more conscious of each other's time and we document all of our work better, no matter where we work, our work days are going to be better, it's going to be easier to do our jobs. But by taking that little extra effort to make things async friendly, we make things possible for everyone. Whereas if one person isn't synchronous friendly, it all very quickly falls apart. So a brief summary of this half of the talk, which I know I'm kind of over time, so I don't know if we'll get to the second half. Very sorry, Will. When we say remote, we've got 2 things to think about: physical separation, not being in the same space, and time separation, not working at the same time. When we talk about not working at the same time, we're interested in the cases in which we block people. And that's either everyone must stop what they're doing until a task is complete, or someone does not have the information they need to complete the task. in that first one, making sure that we don't block people on one task completing. We need to make sure that we prepare in advance so that we remove as many of those opportunities as possible, but where that block is inevitable, we make sure it's a productive block and we push for it quickly. Writing is a super important part of both of these things, and will very quickly expose things that means we might be able to remove a meeting or make that meeting more productive. So practice writing down your ideas, practice explaining things in long form, Slack messages and documents before you go ahead, or meeting briefs before you go ahead and schedule that meeting. Rubber duck with yourself. When you do have those, when you are communicating with someone remotely or not, over communicate, give expectations, give context, give trust, and give deliverables. And that final point, this is all worthless if like someone doesn't do it. Unless everyone is doing it, no one is able to work asynchronously, because information will get lost and fall through the cracks. So establish norms as a team and make sure that your note-taking process, your meeting scheduling process is all known to everyone up front. So that's the end of the schedule, of the kind of plan section. This is onto the personal part, where I just wanted to impress that I've been working remotely and asynchronously now for 6 years. I do that from home, and I also do that from a co-working space. I've moved countries several times in doing this. So I wanted to make some time available just for like the personal parts, or any questions you might have about making that a lifestyle that works for you. So if you have any of those questions, now is the time to ask them. And otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and I hope this was useful.
Appreciate it. That was really, really good, and I'm sure all the other fellows will agree with me that was really cool.